This is a story of pioneering, a story of dynamic and intersecting visions, a story of the building of a community, an enclave by the lake. It's a story of art and nature. This is the story of Guildwood Village. "12,500 years ago, Guildwood Village as we know it today was under the water of Lake Iroquois. Once the waters of that lake receded to the level today of Lake Ontario, it left a plateau from the original shoreline to the top of the bluffs. It was the sacred land of the Huron-Wendat, then the Iroquois Confederacy, the Senecas, and then the Mississaugas. The closest settlement was at the mouth of the Rouge River. Fast forward to 1793 when Scarborough was surveyed by David Thompson, and Elizabeth Graves Simcoe dubbed the bluffs Scarborough Highlands. In her words, quote, "After rowing a mile, we came within sight of what is named, in the map, the Highlands of Toronto. The shore is extremely bold and has the appearance of chalk cliffs, but I believe they are only white sand. They appeared so well that we talked of building a summer residence there and calling it Scarborough." In the 19th century, across Ontario, there was a period of significant settlement, and present-day Guildwood Village, also called for some time the Scarborough Front, saw a number of pioneers in a wave of Irish emigration take up land, most notably James Humphreys. These next three images show the progression in settlement from 1860 to 1878 and 1910. The Grand Trunk Railroad was, and is, the northern boundary of Guildwood Village. And it stayed that way until 1914, when the first seed of the future Guildwood Village was planted. It was called Ranelagh Park, the home of Colonel Harold Child Bickford. From 1921 to 1923, it became the first school in Guildwood, the Francis Xavier China Mission Seminary. The 1920s brought the proposed development of a summer resort colony, cottages that became increasingly derelict. Spot them in this 1939 aerial photograph. They were primarily south and east of Guildwood Parkway in Livingston Road, ultimately the proposed site for a major apartment complex called Livingston Park. In 1932, enter Rosa and Spencer Clark. The era of the Guild of All Arts was about to begin. So too was the enclave that was to be Guildwood Village. Our story now turns to the role of the Guild Inn in developing the vision for what would become a transformational planned community. These were the early Depression years. The Clarks were establishing an ambitious cooperative that integrated the arts and the letters. In Spencer Clark's words, quote, "It was designed more as a social contribution to the times, rather than purely a business venture. Like the Arts and Letters Club of Toronto, it was to become a, quote, comradely haven for kindred souls." The summer cottage resort idea fizzled out, and the Clarks began an undertaking to, quote, "assemble the land from the highway to the lake, and from Scarborough Golf Club Road on the west to Galloway Road on the east. Pick out some of the old cottages on this image in the area that's now south and east of Guildwood Parkway and Livingston Road." In those days, Guildwood Parkway's original name was Eglinton, the broken extension of the road that now ends at Kingston Road, just to the west. The Clarks began to buy and make habitable some of these cottages for use by their patrons. Here are some of the floor plans for the staff cottage, the ward cottage, the waiter's cottage, and baker's cottage. And then, to the west, Guildwood Hall, also called Guildwood's Hall. Guildwood Hall was noteworthy for many reasons, including being the meeting place for the Community Association executive before the building was demolished in 1964. But much more significantly, it was Guildwood's second school, appropriately called Guildwood's School. It opened in 1935, and its brochure identifies one powerful goal. Quote, "The many forms of activity in the art and craft shops, special programs and features about the Guild House, work on the land and construction, the gradual building of a garden village, all bring the school into close relationship with many practical activities, clarifying and coordinating the world of learning and the world of actual life. The Guild did have some early commercial initiatives, such as the making of the raffia water-painted genuine Guild coffee bottles in the studio. Over the winter of 1942, the Armed Forces requisitioned the Guild Inn as an auxiliary training facility for 40 members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, or WRENS, and renamed it HMCS Bytown II. From 1944 to 1947, the Guild Inn was used as a military hospital and renamed, again, Scarborough Hall. Spencer Clark asked the municipal government to consider using the site as a hospital for acute care, but the facility was determined unsuitable. The Guild Inn reopened in 1947. Spencer and Rosa Clark were never idle. They were about to shift their thinking from natural heritage to a planned concept of built heritage. They were buying more land, small lots with single cottages, market gardens, or larger farm blocks, as their vision for a planned community was to change dramatically after 1950. By 1955, they'd acquired 118 properties. They worried about two challenges. One was keeping the Guild financially viable. The second was the potential rapid rate of expansion of Toronto eastward and the risk of amalgamation after the municipality of Metropolitan Toronto was created. Their conclusion? The planning of these lands was not simply another subdivision, but involved the whole community. It was this. They needed a team to unhatch a vision, and that is exactly what happened between 1953 and 1974. What happened next is an intriguing story of economic challenges, a balancing of residential and commercial opportunities, and constant adaptation. The roots of planned communities date back to seminal works by Ebenezer Howard in 1902, B. Seabohm Rowntree in 1908, and Sir Raymond Unwin in 1909. The theme was simple. Planned communities, like Welwyn in the UK, were more sustainable and attractive than uncontrolled growth, and there was a pronounced need to replace slums in England with more affordable and attractive housing. And in the late 1940s, Spencer Clark supported the principles of the Urban Land Institute, which introduced the modern concept of planned communities. This figure shows the concept of the gated introduction to a village, in our case, the Stanley Barracks Gates. In the 1930s, Spencer Clark corresponded with Unwin until Unwin's death in 1940, and Rowntree and Clyde Nichols into the late 1950s. In Spencer Clark's words, quote, "Guildwood Village is an extension of the entire Guild Inn and the Guild of All Arts projects, in which the principals have been working towards the ultimate goal of ideal development." Clark's landholdings were immense, but he needed a revenue source to bring his dream to life. He and his advisors developed the corporate framework to make it all possible. Here's the corporate structure Clark and his team put together. Their first company, Scarborough Guild Limited, became Lakeview Estates Limited. It transferred its properties to 3 companies that all served distinct functions. First, Guild Inn Limited, an operating company with ownership of the lands intended for a golf course that never materialized. Second, Guild Properties Limited, which retained ownership of the central property of the Guild Inn and some properties from the A.R. Hewitson estate. And finally, Guildwood Village Limited, a real estate arm that was responsible for developing properties that included the proposed Livingston Park. It later changed its name to Guildwood Developments Limited. Guildwood took a lot of planning. Here are the brains of Guildwood Development Limited in a number of meetings. The scale model they are looking at used to hang in Bill's hardware store in the plaza. The principal architect was Dr. E.G. Faludi. Spencer Clark recruited the best, and the best to lead his venture was James A. Harris. He is second from the right in this photograph. The team drew up several conceptual sketches and plans. This one features residential development, including apartments, with commercial development on Kingston Road. It would have been in this block. This alternative showed the entire area south and east of Livingston Road in what was then Eglinton. Here's a later concept. The first quadrant would be built either this way or this way. They also sketched out this scary concept, an apartment complex that never was. The village developed in quadrants. The first was the northeast. It had cul-de-sacs, like this one that was never built, and included curving, or what they called curvilinear, streets to discourage fast traffic, and an elongated park system. All the basic components of a garden village. Chantry Court and Surrey Crescent came in 1974 and 1975, respectively. Some of the properties on the west side of Galloway Road were owned by different companies. Part of the garden village model was the use of rolled curbs. That's what we see today in this quadrant. But in May 1959, the Commissioner of Works identified that builders and owners were planting obstructions along these curbs. The recommendation came: no further rolled curbs on residential streets would be allowed at any time in the township of Scarborough. The second quadrant was the northwest, also known as the Dart Farm or the McLean Block. It began like this. The configuration eventually changed. Planners nixed the cul-de-sacs and disconnected the parkland from the northeast quadrant. It ended up like this. From 1934 until the city installed municipal water systems, the springs in the hill were the source of water piped to the Guild Inn at 5 wells on the eastern side of the Laurier Collegiate site. They're on the left here, or just on the right of this photo. The northwest reconfiguration paled in comparison to the next quadrant, the southwest. The first plans saw the park system run through the entire development. That concept did not fit with the city's vision for park planning. The need for an underpass at Guildwood Parkway to make it all work was the final straw, and the original design was abandoned entirely. The southwest quadrant's evolution gets even more interesting. The first plans called for garden court apartments where the townhouses are today. Planners wanted to eliminate Marine Drive and Prince Philip Gate and add an apartment development, including some high-rise units with a view. No wonder there was continued emphasis on strengthening the bluffs. Some streets in this quadrant had different names: Nichols Gate, Welwyn Wood, Brythoft Court, Lincroft Lane, and Clarkwood Crescent. East of Galloway was next. They were known as the Ede and Galloway blocks. There's little information on these developments except for several registered plans. The southeast quadrant came together at the same time. In 1960, planners proposed this. That concept never came to fruition, except for 45 and 55 Livingston. Spencer Clark saw the Guild as the best destination resort in North America. To see that vision through, he saw the shoreline as an important component for commercial success. Here's one element of that. Clark's vision included a funicular railway from the top of the bluffs to the beach, with a cabana club at the bottom. But the principal architect, Dr. Faludi, spoke prophetically. Quote, "At the present moment, we do not know if the provincial government will grant this to us." Spencer Clark liked the idea because it complemented a possible expressway at the foot of the bluffs. Ultimately, however, the funicular was shot down by the Regional Conservation Authority. Spencer Clark abandoned most of his ambitions for the shoreline. He recounted in 1948 how youngsters lit a beach bonfire, ran out of wood, and burned 50 feet of the stairs he had built down the ravine from the Guild Inn to the shore of the lake. Needless to say, Clark decided to stay away from shoreline development until further notice. But even if the novelty of a funicular never came together, a transformational element of Guildwood was evolving. It was known as the Avenue of Homes. The idea: build more fully furnished model homes than had ever been concentrated in one location in Canada. From the sky, it looked like this. The groundbreaking was quite dramatic. Construction soon began on houses and roads. This is the first house, and others under construction. Developers built new roads at the Guild and Guildwood Village. Spot the barn on Barn Hill. The model homes appear to have been developed in 2 phases. The original avenue consisted of 12 model homes, including these 9. Photos in the cookbook Guildwood Cooks show how 5 of those homes look, then and now, including the East Gate, the Dale View, the Fairwood, the York, and the Silverwood. It all opened in August 1957 with a ceremony and huge crowds. Barn Hill offered a particularly impressive view, and signs were everywhere, welcoming people in sales offices and a construction center. The company was called Crescent because its president, Russ Hewitson, had attended Crescent School. Observers called the Avenue of Homes marketing campaign the boldest of its kind yet launched in Canada. Commercial development was always in the cards for Guildwood. Township officials agreed to a community shopping center on the southwest corner of Guildwood Parkway and Livingston Road. The intent was to feature a number of ma-and-pa shops. At the same time, developers were negotiating with Loblaws for a commercial site on the southwest corner of Guildwood Parkway and Kingston Road. It's 41A on this plan, which never came to pass. Planning for the community shopping center began in 1959. It started as a modest project and looked like this. It opened in 1961 with 9 tenants, after construction costs of $140,000. One of the first tenants was the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. There is little information on the plaza's extension to the west, but that phase got underway in 1962. A second piece of the plaza on the north side was added in 1973, and after some construction delays, opened on July 1, 1974. One of the first tenants was the Public Library, which opened on June 13, 1974. A potential longer-term site for the library was ultimately abandoned in the late 1980s. The plaza saw a second bank, the Bank of Montreal. It was first located in the small plaza east of Livingston and moved to its current location in 2009. Research into Sir Wilfrid Laurier Collegiate Institute uncovered some photos taken in 1961 while the school board considered the site. They include Woodvale Road, the northwest corner of Guildwood Parkway and Livingston Road, looking northeast on the east side of Rowatson, looking west on Rowatson, Guildwood Parkway east of Livingston, between 156 and 158 Guildwood Parkway, cottages in the southeast quadrant, looking west on Guildwood Parkway from Forsythia. Guildwood's original plans called for 5 churches: a Baptist, an Anglican, a United, a Presbyterian, and a Catholic. Only the Presbyterian and Anglican churches were ever built. They had 2 remarkably parallel paths, although about 6 years apart. Both had initial sites they did not use, and both used public schools for early services. One was opened in 1964, and the other in 1967. The Presbyterian Church originally purchased land in 1957 from Guildwood Development Limited. 1959 saw them swap properties to the current location of the church. The first service of public worship was held in the portables at Guildwood Public School on December 6, 1959, and moved briefly into the new school facility in March 1960. Planning the new church began in earnest the same year. The architect, George A. Robb, had developed 2 designs. The building was dedicated on Friday, December 18, 1964. Meanwhile, across the street, the Diocese of Toronto had purchased 7 lots of property on the southeast corner of Livingston and Guildwood Parkway in 1961 to build a church. Its first service was held in Poplar Road Public School on November 5, 1961, and the name of the church was approved later that month. Then, in 1964, services moved to Guildwood Public School. At the same time, the parish had a portable on the northernmost lot. A study to investigate a new building on the southern lot had been commissioned in 1963. The sod was turned June 5, 1966, and a procession from Guildwood School honored the dedication of the Church of Holy Trinity on March 9, 1967. At one point in 1972, the parish considered selling off the northern lot. The developer of the plaza extension was interested. Spencer Clark, who had right of first refusal, proposed to the library board that in retaking the northern lot, he would offer it to the board as a library site at half its market value, with the proceeds going to the church. Part of the Garden Village concept was the strategic placement of schools. In fact, in the planning for 2 of the quadrants, northeast and southwest, land was identified specifically for 3 schools. Guildwood was the first, officially called Guildwood Public School in August 1959. Township Council approved the application to build it, and it opened with 6 portables on the separate school site in September 1959. The official opening was March 25, 1960. It was also the school for students soon to switch to Elizabeth Simcoe in 1963. Poplar Road was next, opening with 6 portables in September 1960 and officially opened on February 17, 1961. It expanded in 1969, as this site plan shows. Then came Laurier, and with Laurier, some intrigue. The property where it now stands was, at the time, still in the plans for an apartment complex. The board considered 2 sites, the current site and on the same property as Guildwood Public School. They picked this site south of Guildwood Parkway. Originally, it was to be named Guildwood Collegiate Institute, but on March 20th, 1963, was renamed to its current name. The school was based on this design and underwent construction, including the required demolition of Guildwood Hall, just down the road from where the school would stand. Laurier opened March 29, 1966. Elizabeth Simcoe came next. Until 1962, it was known as Guildwood Public School Site No. 2. Then came Jack Minor. The property was expropriated by the school board in 1969. Originally called Lakeview Senior School, it was renamed Jack Minor in February 1969 and opened its doors in September 1971. Finally, St. Ursula was opened in 1964 with this site plan, and decades later, the 2017 addition was completed according to this site plan. The streets of Guildwood Village are a story in and of themselves. They were named after some of the garden villages of England, including Bourneville, which was built by Cadbury Chocolates. Some streets were named after specific people, including Navarre Crescent, named after Henri de Navarre, the King of France. Some streets saw their names changed. Old Orchard Boulevard, named after a nearby orchard, became Toynbee Trail. And Francis becomes Catalina, named after Catalina Island. Some street names never were. A few are pretty self-evident as tied to the Brythot, Hewitson, and Clark families, and others to planning associates. And that's the story. How we got from here to here, helped in the war effort along the way, and arrived here, in a community so rich in parkland. This neighborhood is many things to many people, but more than anything, Guildwood is a place villagers will always call home.